Abandoned by my husband, forgotten by my children, living a miserable life in a house falling apart around me, until I found a yellow metal box buried in the dirt, and everything changed. My hands were shaking as I pulled that box from the ground after the worst dust storm Phoenix had seen in decades. Inside were papers that would make the family who threw me away come crawling back, begging for forgiveness and money. But they had no idea that this forgotten old woman had learned the difference between charity and justice. Let me back up. 2 days ago, I thought I was the loneliest grandmother in Arizona. 71 years old, living on Social Security in a house my late mother left me, watching my neighbors through dusty windows while wondering if anyone would even notice if I died. I'm Esperanza Delgado, and I'm 74 years old, here in my beautiful new home today, surrounded by legal documents that prove sometimes the universe has a sense of humor and perfect timing. But that morning, I was just a broken woman who'd given everything to people who decided I wasn't worth their time anymore. You know what? If you're listening to my story right now, tell me in the comments what you're doing. Maybe you're cleaning your house, taking care of someone who doesn't appreciate you, or sitting alone wondering if your sacrifices meant anything. Hit that like button, because each like is so important to help my voice reach other women who need to know they're not invisible just because their families decided they were. And subscribe to Grandma's Legacy, because every grandmother deserves to know that her story matters, especially when that story ends with the people who abandoned her learning exactly what they lost. Now I'm here in my office, looking at bank statements that would make my ex-husband Roberto weep with regret. If he weren't too busy begging me for money, he'll never see. But 2 days ago, I was just sweeping dust off my front porch, completely unaware that my grandmother's greatest gift was buried right under my feet. Let me tell you about the life I built that everyone decided wasn't worth keeping, and the family I raised who learned to see me as a burden instead of a blessing. I met Roberto Delgado in 1973 at a church dance in South Phoenix when I was 23 and he was 25. He had the kind of confidence that made a young woman feel protected, the kind of smile that promised a future full of love and security. We married 8 months later at Our Lady of Guadalupe, with my mother crying happy tears and his mother already making plans for the grandchildren we'd give her. Roberto worked construction while I cleaned houses for the wealthy families in Scottsdale, both of us putting in long hours to build something together. We bought our first house in 1975, a small adobe place in a neighborhood that was mostly Mexican-American families like us, everyone working hard and taking care of each other. Our son Carlos was born in 1976, and our daughter Marisol followed in 1978. They were beautiful children, Carlos with his father's charming smile, and Marisol with my mother's gentle eyes. I worked part-time so I could be home when they got out of school, making sure they had help with homework, hot meals, and all the love I could give them. But here's what I built while I was raising them: a foundation of sacrifice that I thought meant something. Every dollar Roberto made in construction, I stretched until it screamed. Every house I cleaned in Scottsdale, I saved tips in a coffee can hidden behind the flour. When Carlos wanted to play Little League, I took extra cleaning jobs to pay for his uniform and equipment. When Marisol needed a dress for her quinceañera, I worked double shifts for 3 months to make her celebration perfect. "Mija, family comes first," my mother used to tell me as she watched me iron Roberto's work clothes at midnight after a 12-hour day. "Everything else is secondary. Family comes first." I believed that with every fiber of my being, right up until the day I learned that not everyone in the family felt the same way. The children grew up and moved away, Carlos to Colorado for college, then to California for work. Marisol to Tucson, after marrying a man who made it clear that Phoenix visits were inconvenient for their schedule. They called on holidays, sent cards on birthdays, and gradually made me understand that I was becoming a nice memory rather than a current priority. But Roberto stayed, and I thought that meant something. I thought 43 years of marriage counted for something. I thought the woman who'd supported his dreams, raised his children, and stood by him through job losses and health scares had earned some loyalty. I was about to learn how wrong I could be about the man I'd shared my bed with for 4 decades. The betrayal started small, like poison administered in careful doses. Roberto began talking about investments and opportunities that could secure our retirement. He'd come home from his job as a foreman with stories about other men who'd made smart decisions with their money, who were now living comfortably instead of worrying about Social Security and medical bills. Esperanza, we have $38,000 in savings, he said one evening in 2019, spreading papers across our kitchen table. That money is just sitting in the bank earning nothing. My friend Miguel knows about a real estate investment that could double our money in 2 years. $38,000, 45 years of coffee cans, double shifts, and sacrifice, every penny I'd saved while he spent his paychecks on beer and tools. Roberto, that's our security. What if one of us gets sick? What if the house needs repairs? What if we're smart with our money instead of scared? He replied, using the tone that meant the discussion was over whether I agreed or not. I signed the papers because I trusted him. Because 43 years of marriage meant something. Because I believed that the man who'd promised to take care of me would keep that promise. 6 months later, Roberto's investment had vanished along with our savings. Miguel's real estate opportunity turned out to be a sophisticated scam that targeted elderly couples in our community. By the time we realized what had happened, Miguel was gone, our money was gone, and we were left with nothing but worthless contracts and the bitter taste of our own stupidity. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came when I discovered that Roberto hadn't been fooled by Miguel's scam. He'd been part of it, using our savings as his buy-in to a scheme that defrauded dozens of families in our neighborhood. When the scam collapsed, Roberto took his cut and ran, leaving me with debt collectors, angry neighbors, and a foreclosure notice on the house my mother had died in. The divorce papers were delivered by a teenager on a bicycle, like an afterthought. Roberto wanted nothing from our marriage except freedom from responsibility for the debts he'd helped create. He'd already moved in with a woman named Sandra, 20 years younger and impressed by his sudden financial resources. 45 years of marriage dissolved in a folder of legal documents that made it clear. I'd been married to a stranger who'd spent decades planning to abandon me the moment he found something better. When I called Carlos and Marisol to tell them what had happened, their responses taught me that betrayal runs in families. "Mom, this is really hard timing for us," Carlos said from his comfortable house in San Diego. "Jennifer is pregnant with our second baby, and I just can't take on additional financial responsibilities right now." Additional financial responsibilities. That's how my son referred to his mother's crisis. Marisol was more direct. "Mom, you need to start thinking about your future more realistically. Maybe this is the universe telling you it's time to downsize. Maybe move to senior housing, where you won't have to worry about maintaining a house." Senior housing. My daughter's solution to my husband's betrayal was for me to disappear into an institution where I wouldn't inconvenience anyone with my problems. That's how I ended up alone in my mother's house, living on $900 a month in Social Security, watching pieces of the roof fall into buckets during monsoon season, and learning that the family I'd built my life around had decided I wasn't worth saving. But I was about to discover that my real family had left me something far more valuable than the one I'd raised and married into. Living alone in a house that was slowly crumbling around me taught me lessons about survival that 45 years of marriage had never required. The first winter after Roberto left was the hardest. The heating system broke in December, and the repair estimate was $800, almost my entire month's income. I spent 3 months wearing every sweater I owned and sleeping with 4 blankets. Too proud to ask Carlos and Marisol for help, I knew they wouldn't provide anyway. "Mom, you really need to think about your living situation," Carlos said during one of his increasingly rare phone calls. "That house is too much for someone your age to handle alone." Someone my age. I was 71, not dead. Carlos, I've been maintaining this house since before you were born. I know how to fix what breaks and work around what doesn't. But that's exactly the problem, Mom. You shouldn't have to live like that. There are nice places where people your age can have maintenance-free living, social activities, medical care nearby. People my age. Nice places. He was talking about warehousing me somewhere convenient, somewhere that wouldn't require him to feel guilty about never visiting. The conversations with Marisol were worse because she was more direct about her impatience with my stubbornness. Mom, you're being impractical, she said during her last visit, walking through my house like she was conducting a health inspection. The roof leaks, the plumbing is old, the electrical system probably hasn't been updated since the 1980s. You're one accident away from a disaster. One accident away from a disaster. As if I hadn't been living through disasters already, managing them with the competence I'd developed over decades of making impossible situations work. But the real message became clear during what I now think of as the intervention. A surprise visit from both children in March 2022, exactly 2 years after Roberto had abandoned me. They arrived together, which should have been my first warning. Carlos and Marisol hadn't been in the same room since Marisol's wedding 8 years earlier. When they showed up at my door together, armed with folders full of brochures and concerned expressions, I knew I was about to be managed rather than supported. Mom, we've been talking, and we think it's time to have a serious conversation about your future, Carlos began, settling into my kitchen like he was conducting a business meeting. We've researched some really nice senior communities in the area, Marisol added, spreading glossy brochures across the table where I ate my solitary meals. Places where you could have your own apartment but also have help with cooking, cleaning, maintenance, medical emergencies. Help with cooking, cleaning, maintenance. The things I'd been doing successfully for my entire adult life suddenly presented as tasks too complex for my declining capabilities. And the best part is, you could sell this house and use the money to pay for several years of care, Carlos continued. The equity would give you real financial security instead of this month-to-month struggle. Sell this house. The house my mother had left me. The house where I'd raised them. The house that represented the only stability I had left in a world where everyone I'd ever trusted had decided I was expendable. This house is my home, I said quietly. It's all I have left of my mother, of our family, of the life I built. Mom, that's exactly the problem, Marisol replied with the kind of patience people use when talking to children. You're holding on to the past instead of planning for the future. What happens when you can't climb stairs anymore? What happens when you have a medical emergency and no one is here to help? What happens when no one is here to help? The question hung in the air like an accusation. I'd failed to maintain relationships that would care for me in old age, so now I needed to pay professionals to provide the care my family couldn't be bothered with. What about visiting me wherever I live? I asked. What about calling more than once a month? What about treating me like your mother instead of a problem you need to solve? The look they exchanged told me everything. I wasn't their mother anymore. I was their burden. An obligation they wanted to transfer to someone else so they could get on with their lives without guilt. Mom, be realistic, Carlos said. We both have our own families, our own responsibilities. We can't be your full-time caregivers. Full-time caregivers. As if asking for occasional visits and regular phone calls was demanding round-the-clock nursing. After they left, without helping fix the kitchen faucet that had been dripping for 3 months, without staying for the dinner I'd prepared, hoping to have my children at my table again, I sat in my empty house and understood the truth about family loyalty. It flows in one direction, until the people receiving it decide you've outlived your usefulness. But I also understood something else. I was 71 years old, not dead. I'd survived Roberto's betrayal, my children's abandonment, and 2 years of poverty that would have broken someone who hadn't spent decades making miracles out of nothing. I was tougher than they thought, smarter than they assumed, and more valuable than they'd ever bothered to discover. I just didn't know how valuable until the universe decided to show me exactly what they'd thrown away. The dust storm that changed my life hit Phoenix on a Tuesday morning in April, exactly 2 months after my children's intervention. The Weather Service called it a haboob, a massive wall of dust and wind that turned day into night and buried everything in its path under inches of desert sand. I'd lived through dozens of these storms over the years, but this one felt different, more violent, more personal, like nature itself was angry about something and taking it out on everyone in its path. For 6 hours, I sat in my dark house listening to wind that sounded like screaming and debris hitting my walls like artillery. The power went out around noon, and I spent the afternoon reading by candlelight, trying not to think about what the cleanup would cost or how I'd manage repairs I couldn't afford. When the storm finally passed and I could safely go outside, my yard looked like a war zone. My neighbor's trash cans had blown into my fence, tree branches covered my driveway, and everything, absolutely everything, was buried under a thick layer of fine desert dust that turned the world beige. But as I started sweeping my front porch, something caught my eye. Near the corner of my property, where the storm had been particularly violent, the ground looked different, disturbed, like something had been unearthed by all that wind and sand. That's when I saw the corner of something yellow sticking up from the dirt. At first, I thought it was trash, maybe a paint can or toolbox that had blown into my yard from somewhere else. But as I dug around it with my hands, I realized it was buried too deep to be storm debris. This had been underground for a long time. It took me 20 minutes of careful digging to free the yellow metal box from the earth. It was about the size of a shoebox, made of heavy steel that had resisted rust despite however many years it had spent buried in Arizona soil. There was no lock, just a simple latch that opened with a satisfying click. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth that had protected them from moisture and time, were papers. Old papers, legal documents, and a letter in my grandmother's handwriting that I recognized even though she'd been dead for 30 years. "Mija," the letter began, "if you are reading this, it means the storm I always knew would come has finally arrived. What you will find in this box belongs to you, as it belonged to me, as it belonged to my mother before me. The men in our family take what they want and leave us to manage with what remains. But the women in our family, we prepare for storms, even the ones we hope will never come." My hands were shaking as I read my grandmother's words, written in the careful Spanish script I remembered from birthday cards and grocery lists from my childhood. "In 1943, when your grandfather was gambling away our savings and chasing other women, I bought land. 847 acres in the Sonoran Desert, east of Phoenix, paid for with money I earned washing clothes and selling tamales. I told no one, not even your mother, because I knew that knowledge of money makes men dangerous and women careless. 847 acres. In 1943, that land would have been considered worthless desert, miles from civilization and good for nothing but grazing cattle and hiding mistakes. I buried these papers here, in the yard of the house I left to your mother, because I knew that one day one of the women in our family would need what I saved for them. The land has grown valuable. I have watched the city expand toward it, watched developers circle it like vultures. But it belongs to you now, Mija. Use it wisely. Use it to make the men who abandoned you regret their choice. Use it to make the men who abandoned you regret their choice." My grandmother had somehow known, 30 years before it happened, that I would be betrayed and abandoned by my own family. The deed was there, signed and notarized, transferring 847 acres of Sonoran desert land from Maria Elena Vasquez to her granddaughter, Esperanza Elena Vasquez Delgado, dated 1992, the year before my grandmother died. But it was the mineral rights document that made me sit down hard on my dusty porch steps. The land my grandmother had bought for practically nothing in 1943 sat directly above what geologists now knew was one of the richest copper deposits in Arizona. Mining companies had been trying to buy that exact area for 15 years, but they couldn't because the ownership records had been lost in a courthouse fire in 1978. I owned 847 acres of land that 3 different mining companies were prepared to pay $8 million to lease. $8 million for mineral rights to property I'd never known existed. But in that moment, if you're feeling the shock of discovering that your supposedly worthless life was actually incredibly valuable all along, show your support. Hit that like button. Comment if you've ever found out you were worth more than the people who abandoned you ever imagined, and subscribe because we strong women need to stick together when the universe finally gives us the last laugh. As I sat on my porch reading legal documents that proved I was potentially worth $8 million, I started laughing. Not happy laughter, the kind of laughter that comes when irony is so perfect it's almost cruel. Roberto had stolen my life savings and abandoned me for a younger woman, leaving me nothing except a house he considered worthless. Carlos and Marisol had written me off as a burden, suggesting I sell my property and disappear into senior housing where I wouldn't inconvenience anyone. Meanwhile, I'd been sitting on $8 million in mineral rights, living in poverty and loneliness, while everyone who'd betrayed me went about their lives secure in the knowledge that they'd discarded someone of no value. But they were about to learn that their discarded, worthless, burdensome old woman was actually the wealthiest person in the family. And I was about to learn exactly what that knowledge could do to people who thought they'd gotten rid of me forever. The next morning, I did something I hadn't done in 3 years. I got dressed like I mattered. I put on my best dress, the black one I'd bought for Roberto's mother's funeral and hadn't worn since, along with my mother's pearl earrings and the dignity I'd forgotten I possessed. Then I drove my 2008 Honda Civic to the law offices of Harrison, Lopez and Associates, carrying my grandmother's yellow box and a confidence that felt foreign after years of apologizing for taking up space. Mrs. Delgado, these documents appear to be authentic and properly executed, Attorney Sarah Lopez said, after examining my grandmother's papers for 2 hours. If the mineral surveys are accurate, and I have no reason to doubt they are, you own exclusive rights to copper mining on some of the most valuable undeveloped land in Arizona. Exclusive rights. The most valuable undeveloped land in Arizona. Words I'd never imagined applying to anything I possessed. There are 3 mining companies that have been trying to acquire these specific mineral rights for over a decade, she continued, pulling up files on her computer. Southwestern Copper, Desert Mining Consortium, and Phoenix Mineral Resources. They've been involved in legal disputes about this land for years, not knowing that the actual owner was living 15 miles away in a house with a leaking roof. Living 15 miles away in a house with a leaking roof. The irony was so perfect it was almost painful. What are my options? I asked. You can sell the mineral rights outright for approximately $8 million. You can lease them for annual payments of approximately $1 million per year for the next 10 years. Or you can negotiate a partnership deal that would make you a major shareholder in the mining operation. $8 million, $1 million per year, major shareholder. Numbers I'd never imagined having any connection to my life. Mrs. Delgado, may I ask what you'd like to do with this information? What I wanted to do was transform from the discarded, worthless burden my family had written off into the woman my grandmother had always believed I could become. First, I want you to verify everything. Confirm the mineral surveys, research the companies, make sure this is as real as it looks. Then I want you to help me decide which option puts me in the strongest position for the long term. And Mrs. Delgado? May I suggest that you not discuss this discovery with anyone until we've completed our research and developed a strategy? Information about this kind of wealth can complicate family relationships. Complicate family relationships. She had no idea how complicated they were about to become. That afternoon, while Attorney Lopez began the process of confirming my newfound wealth, I went home and did something else I hadn't done in years. I planned revenge. Not the dramatic, destructive kind you see in movies. The patient, strategic kind that comes from understanding people's motivations and giving them exactly what they think they want until they realize what they've lost. I knew Roberto would be the first to come crawling back. His relationship with Sandra was already showing strain. I'd heard through mutual friends that her enthusiasm for his retirement savings had dimmed considerably when she realized how limited those savings actually were. Carlos would be next. His pregnant wife, Jennifer, was already complaining about money, and his tech job in San Diego was less secure than he'd implied. He'd need financial help soon, and he'd remember that I was his mother before he remembered that he'd written me off as a burden. Marisol would take longer, but she'd come eventually. Her husband's construction business was struggling, and they'd been talking about buying a bigger house they couldn't afford. When they needed co-signers or down payment assistance, they'd suddenly remember that family relationships could be repaired. But I wasn't planning to make it easy for them. I was planning to make it educational. 3 days later, Attorney Lopez called with confirmation that exceeded even my optimistic expectations. Mrs. Delgado, the mineral rights are worth exactly what we initially estimated. The copper deposit is substantial, and there's also significant silver content. We're looking at $8 million for outright sale, or annual lease payments of $1 million per year for 10 years. $8 million. $1 million per year. Numbers that transformed me from a woman living on Social Security into someone who could solve every financial problem anyone in my family had ever mentioned. There's also something else, she continued. One of the mining companies, Phoenix Mineral Resources, is owned by a consortium that includes several investors your family might know. Roberto Delgado is listed as a minority partner. Roberto was a partner in the company that wanted to buy my mineral rights. The man who'd stolen my savings and abandoned me for a younger woman was about to discover that the worthless woman he'd discarded owned the rights to make him even wealthier than he'd dreamed. But he was also about to discover that I'd learned the difference between being used and being valued. Attorney Lopez, I want to lease the rights rather than sell them. Annual payments for 20 years. But I have some specific conditions about how this information is revealed and when payments begin. What kind of conditions? The kind that ensure everyone who abandoned me learns exactly what they threw away and exactly how much it's going to cost them to get it back. What I was planning wasn't just revenge. It was justice with compound interest and a side of poetic irony that my grandmother would have appreciated. The news leaked exactly as I'd planned it to leak, through Rosa Martinez, the biggest gossip in our neighborhood, who happened to be having coffee with Sandra, Roberto's new girlfriend, when the mining company trucks arrived to begin surveying my land. "Esperanza Delgado?" Rosa had said, loud enough for half the coffee shop to hear. "The woman who lives in that house with the broken fence? She owns all that land out by Ahwatukee? The land worth millions?" The land worth millions. By that evening, Rosa had spread the news to 12 families, Sandra had told Roberto, and the phone calls started coming. Roberto was first, of course. "Esperanza, mija, I heard the craziest rumor." His voice was carefully casual, but I could hear the hunger underneath. "Someone said you inherited some land from your grandmother. That can't be right, can it?" Mija. He hadn't called me that in 5 years, not since he'd started planning his escape with my savings. "It's true, Roberto. Turns out Abuela left me 847 acres, and the mining companies want to lease the mineral rights." "Mining companies?" His voice cracked slightly. "How much are we talking about, Esperanza?" "We. After abandoning me with debt and disgrace, after stealing my life savings for a scam, after filing divorce papers that made it clear he wanted nothing to do with my problems. Now we were partners again." "About $1 million a year for 10 years, I said, letting the number sink in. The silence lasted so long I thought he'd hung up. Then, "Esperanza, we need to talk. This changes everything between us. I know I made mistakes, but we were married for 43 years. That has to count for something. That has to count for something. Now, suddenly, our marriage was an asset he wanted to reclaim. Where would you like to meet, Roberto? What about our house? I could come by tonight and we could discuss this properly. Our house, the house he'd walked away from without looking back, that he'd left me to maintain alone while he built a new life with someone else's money. I'll be here at 7. He arrived at 6:30, dressed in his best shirt and carrying flowers. Cheap ones from the grocery store, but flowers nonetheless. Behind him was Sandra, trying to look invisible while clearly hoping to be part of whatever reconciliation would get her access to my newfound wealth. "Esperanza, you look wonderful," he said, handing me the flowers like we were teenagers on a first date. "I've missed you so much." He'd missed me. The woman he'd robbed and abandoned had suddenly become worth missing. "Come in, Roberto. Sandra, you can wait in the car." "Actually, I thought Sandra should be part of this conversation," he said quickly. "She's been part of my life for 3 years now, and she deserves to understand how this affects our future." Our future. He was already planning how to spend my money with his girlfriend. "Roberto, let me be very clear about something. Sandra has no part in any conversation about my inheritance, my decisions, or my future. She can wait in the car, or you can leave, and we can have this discussion another time." He chose to send Sandra to the car, which told me everything about his priorities. For the next 2 hours, Roberto performed the most elaborate apology I'd ever witnessed. He was sorry for the investment scam, sorry for leaving me with debts, sorry for the divorce, sorry for not being the husband I deserved. But mostly, he was sorry that he'd given up his claim to half of everything I owned. "I know I hurt you, Esperanza, but I never stopped loving you," he said, reaching across my kitchen table to touch my hand. "When I heard about this land, my first thought was how happy I was that something good finally happened to you. You deserve this blessing. You deserve this blessing." As if my inheritance was a gift I'd received, rather than something I'd owned all along while he was stealing my savings. "What exactly are you suggesting, Roberto?" "I'm suggesting we belong together for 43 years for a reason. I'm suggesting that maybe this windfall is God's way of giving us a second chance. I'm suggesting that we could rebuild our marriage and our life together, stronger than before. Rebuild our marriage and our life together. With my money, in my house, while he continued living with Sandra until he decided which arrangement was more profitable." "Roberto, that's a beautiful thought. But I have some questions first." "Of course, mija. Anything. Are you still living with Sandra?" He shifted uncomfortably. "That's complicated. But if we're talking about getting back together, obviously I would end that relationship. Obviously. When my money made him wealthy enough to afford his own place, instead of depending on Sandra's income. What about the money you stole from our savings? The $38,000 you invested in Miguel's scam?" "Esperanza, I know that looks bad, but I was trying to make us wealthy. I believed Miguel when he said we could double our money. I was fooled, just like you were." He was fooled, just like I was. Except I'd later learned from the FBI investigation that Roberto had recruited 4 other couples for Miguel's scam, earning a commission for each family he brought in. "Roberto, here's what's going to happen. I'm going to take some time to think about your proposal. You're going to go home to Sandra and consider whether you really want to leave her for a woman you abandoned when she had nothing. And we'll talk again when I've made my decision about how I want to spend my money and my future." "When will that be?" "When I'm ready, Roberto. Not when you need an answer." After he left, after kissing my cheek and promising to call tomorrow and swearing that Sandra meant nothing compared to our decades of marriage, I sat in my kitchen and laughed until I cried. Because Roberto wasn't the only member of my family who was about to discover exactly what they'd thrown away. Carlos called the next morning. "Mom, I heard the most amazing news." Carlos's voice was bright with an enthusiasm I hadn't heard since his childhood. "Rosa Martinez called Jennifer's mother, who called Jennifer, who told me that you inherited valuable land from great-grandmother Maria. Is that really true?" Great-grandmother Maria. He hadn't mentioned her name in 15 years, but suddenly she was a cherished family connection worth acknowledging. "It's true, mijo. Your great-grandmother left me mineral rights that the mining companies want to lease." "Mom, that's incredible. I'm so happy for you. You deserve something wonderful after everything you've been through." "Everything I've been through. The struggles he'd dismissed as poor life choices were suddenly tragic hardships worthy of compensation. How much are we talking about, Mom? If you don't mind me asking. We. Carlos hadn't used that word when discussing my problems, but my solutions were apparently community property. About $2 million a year, Carlos. I heard him drop something. $2 million? Per year? For how long? 20 years. $40 million total. The silence stretched so long, I thought the call had dropped. Then, Mom, this is life-changing money. Not just for you, but for our whole family. Jennifer and I have been talking about how we can help you more, and now with this blessing, maybe we can all help each other. Help each other. The son who'd told me he couldn't take on additional financial responsibilities when I was facing foreclosure now wanted to discuss mutual assistance. What kind of help were you thinking about, Carlos? Well, Jennifer is due in 3 months, and we've been looking at bigger houses in better school districts. The payments would be tight, but if we knew we had family support for the down payment. Family support. $20,000 for his house down payment would now be family support instead of financial burden. And there's something else, Mom. I've been thinking about starting my own consulting business, but I need capital for office space, equipment, initial marketing, maybe $50,000 to get started properly. $50,000 to get started properly. The son who'd suggested I sell my house and move to senior housing was now planning a business expansion funded by my windfall. Carlos, those sound like wonderful opportunities. Have you discussed them with Marisol? Actually, that's another thing. Marisol called this morning, and she's driving up from Tucson this weekend. She wants to have a family meeting to discuss how we can all work together to make sure this money benefits everyone fairly. Benefits everyone fairly. My inheritance was apparently a family asset that needed to be distributed equitably among people who'd contributed nothing to earning it. A family meeting sounds like a good idea, I said. I'll cook dinner Sunday, and we can all sit down together. That's perfect, Mom. And Mom, I want you to know how sorry I am about the way I've been lately. I know I haven't been the son you deserve, but this news has made me realize how important family really is. How important family really is. $2 million a year had given Carlos a sudden appreciation for family connections he'd been neglecting. Marisol's call came that afternoon, following almost the same script. Mom, I am so excited about your good news. When Carlos told me about great-grandmother Maria's gift, I literally started crying with happiness for you. Great-grandmother Maria's gift. The land that had been buried and forgotten was now a thoughtful legacy from a beloved ancestor. It's been quite a surprise, mija. Mom, I have been feeling so guilty about not spending more time with you lately. Miguel and I have been talking about how we need to prioritize family more, especially now that you're going to have resources to really enjoy life. Resources to really enjoy life. My poverty had been a personal failing, but my wealth was a family celebration. What did you have in mind, Marisol? Well, Miguel's construction business has been struggling, but he's identified some amazing investment opportunities. Real estate development projects that could benefit the whole family if we pool our resources. Pool our resources. My mineral rights had somehow become our collective investment portfolio. And Mom, I've been thinking about how isolated you've been in that old house. With your new financial security, you could afford a beautiful place closer to family. Maybe something here in Tucson or even in California near Carlos. We could all be together again. All be together again. The daughter who'd suggested I move to senior housing was now planning family reunions funded by my inheritance. That's thoughtful of you to think about, Marisol. I'm driving up Sunday for Carlos's family meeting. I can't wait to see you and discuss all the wonderful possibilities this opens up for our family. Our family. After 3 years of rare phone calls and obligatory holiday cards, we were suddenly a close-knit unit with shared financial interests. That weekend, I prepared for the most important dinner party of my life. Not because I was cooking for my children. I'd been doing that for decades while they gradually lost interest. but because I was finally going to serve them exactly what they'd earned. Sunday arrived with the kind of perfect Arizona weather that makes you understand why people move to the desert. Bright sunshine, clear blue sky, and the kind of dry heat that feels clean after months of winter humidity. I spent the morning preparing Roberto's favorite meal, carne asada, rice and beans, fresh tortillas, and the chocolate cake I'd made for every birthday and celebration for 43 years. Not because I wanted to welcome him back, but because I wanted him to taste exactly what he'd thrown away. Carlos and Jennifer arrived first, with their toddler and a gift bag from an expensive store I'd never been able to afford. "For the grandmother who deserves the very best," Jennifer said, kissing my cheek like we'd been close friends instead of polite strangers for 8 years. Marisol and Miguel came next, with flowers, wine, and an enthusiasm that would have been touching if it weren't so transparently motivated by money. "Mom, you look amazing," Marisol gushed. "Success suits you. Success suits you." The same woman who told me I was being impractical about maintaining my independence now found my appearance improved by wealth. Roberto arrived last, alone, carrying a bottle of champagne and wearing the expression of a man who'd spent the weekend convincing himself he deserved a second chance at happiness and financial security. We sat around my kitchen table, the same table where Roberto had convinced me to invest our savings in Miguel's scam, the same table where Carlos and Marisol had spread brochures for senior housing, the same table where I'd eaten solitary meals for 3 years while everyone I'd raised learned to live without me. But tonight, they were all focused on me with laser intensity, hanging on every word, laughing at every comment, treating me like the most fascinating person they'd ever met. "Mom, we want you to know how proud we are of you," Carlos began, raising his champagne glass. "You've been so strong through everything, and now you're being rewarded for all your sacrifices." Rewarded for all your sacrifices. The sacrifices that had been dismissed as poor choices were now admirable investments in family welfare. "To Esperanza," Roberto added, "the strongest woman I've ever known, who deserves every blessing coming her way." The strongest woman he'd ever known. The woman he'd robbed and abandoned was suddenly worthy of admiration and champagne toasts. They spent 2 hours telling me how much they loved me, how sorry they were for being distant, how excited they were to have me back in their lives now that I had the resources to really enjoy family relationships. Then they started making suggestions. Carlos thought I should invest in his consulting business and help with his house down payment. Marisol believed Miguel's construction projects would benefit everyone. Roberto was convinced that remarriage would provide both emotional and financial advantages for our future security. Everyone had plans for my money that would conveniently solve their individual problems while strengthening our family bonds. "These all sound like wonderful opportunities," I said when they'd finished their presentations. "But I have something to tell you about my plans for this inheritance." They leaned forward with eager anticipation, ready to hear how I would distribute my windfall among the people who'd finally remembered they loved me. "I'm not sharing it with any of you." The silence was so complete I could hear the air conditioning cycling on in the next room. "What do you mean, Mom?" Marisol asked carefully. "I mean that not $1 of this inheritance will go to anyone in this room. Not for down payments, not for business investments, not for reconciliation, not for anything. You abandoned me when I had nothing, so you get nothing now that I have something." Roberto found his voice first. "Esperanza, you're upset, I understand. But this is emotional thinking, not practical thinking. We're family. We belong together. We were family when you stole my savings and left me with debt collectors, Roberto. We were family when you suggested I move to senior housing so I wouldn't inconvenience you, Carlos. We were family when you told me to be realistic about my declining capabilities, Marisol. Where was all this family loyalty when I needed it?" "Mom, people make mistakes," Jennifer said quietly. "But family forgives. That's what makes us family." "Family forgives," I repeated. "But family also remembers. I remember every phone call you didn't make, every visit you didn't plan, every time you made it clear that my problems were mine alone. Now, my solutions are mine alone too." "But Mom," Carlos said desperately. "We want to make things right. We want to be the family you deserve. The family I deserve would have been there when I was living on $900 a month. The family I deserve would have helped fix my roof instead of suggesting I sell my house. The family I deserve would have valued me before I became valuable." I stood up from the table where I'd served them their last free meal. "Roberto, you chose Sandra and my stolen savings over 43 years of marriage. Live with that choice. Carlos, you chose your convenience over your mother's welfare. Live with that choice. Marisol, you chose judgment over compassion when I needed support. Live with that choice." "So what are you going to do with all that money?" Roberto asked, his charm finally dropping to reveal the desperation underneath. "I'm going to do what my grandmother did with her money, use it to take care of the women in my family who understand that strength comes from independence, not from waiting for men to rescue them. What I was planning was bigger than revenge. I was planning to build something that would help other abandoned women discover their own strength, their own value, and their own capacity to survive and thrive without the people who'd decided they were expendable." Sitting here in my beautiful new office this morning, looking at the plans for the Maria Elena Vasquez Center for Women's Independence, I want you to understand something important about family, loyalty, and the difference between being valued and being used. When Roberto, Carlos, and Marisol looked at me after my inheritance, they saw an opportunity to solve their financial problems through family connections they'd spent years neglecting. They saw an elderly woman whose newfound wealth made her suddenly worthy of their time, attention, and affection. But when I looked at myself in the mirror that morning after sending them away empty-handed, I saw something entirely different. I saw a woman who'd survived abandonment, betrayal, and 3 years of poverty that would have broken someone who hadn't spent decades turning nothing into something. I saw my grandmother's granddaughter, a woman smart enough to prepare for storms, strong enough to weather them alone, and wise enough to know the difference between people who love you and people who love what you can do for them. The Maria Elena Vasquez Center opened 6 months after I claimed my inheritance in a beautiful building in central Phoenix that serves women who've been abandoned by families, betrayed by husbands, or written off by societies that see aging women as burdens rather than resources. We provide legal services for women fighting financial abuse, business loans for those starting over at ages when the world tells them they're too old to begin again, and housing assistance for those who've lost everything to men who promised to take care of them forever. Our first client was Isabella Morales, whose son had been stealing her Social Security checks while promising to manage her finances. Our second was Carmen Rodriguez, whose husband had drained their joint accounts and disappeared with a woman half his age. Our third was Patricia Santos, whose daughters had convinced her to sign power of attorney documents that gave them control over her life savings. These weren't helpless victims waiting for rescue. These were competent, intelligent women who'd been systematically undermined by people who were supposed to protect them, then blamed for their own victimization. We helped them reclaim their money, rebuild their independence, and remember that survival is a skill that improves with practice. But the most satisfying part wasn't helping other women, though that work feeds my soul in ways I'd never expected. The most satisfying part was watching my family's reaction to discovering that their abandoned, worthless burden had become someone they needed more than she needed them. Roberto called every few weeks for the first year, alternating between apologies, threats, and promises depending on how Sandra's mood affected his living situation. When she finally threw him out for spending too much time focused on his ex-wife's money, he showed up at my door with suitcases and tears, begging for a second chance at the marriage he'd destroyed. I helped him find a studio apartment he could afford on his Social Security and construction pension. I even co-signed the lease because I'm not cruel. But I also made sure he understood that charity isn't the same as reconciliation, and kindness doesn't erase betrayal. Carlos and Marisol took different approaches to managing their disappointment. Carlos became angry, telling mutual friends that I was bitter and selfish for hoarding money that could benefit his children's education and future opportunities. Marisol became manipulative, sending cards on holidays that emphasized how much my grandchildren missed their successful abuela and hoped to spend more time with me. Neither approach changed my mind, but both approaches taught me something important. People who abandon you when you're struggling will often blame you for their own choices when you succeed without them. Last month, I received a letter from Carlos that began, "Mom, I've been doing a lot of thinking, and I realize now that family is more important than money. Family is more important than money." The same son who'd told me he couldn't take on additional financial responsibilities when I was facing foreclosure now wanted to discuss the relative value of family relationships versus material wealth. I wrote back, "Carlos, I agree completely. Family is more important than money. That's why I spent 40 years putting family first, sacrificing my own needs for people I loved. It's also why I now understand that real family relationships aren't contingent on financial benefit. The people who love you when you have nothing are family. The people who remember you exist only when you have something are customers." I never heard back from him. But I did hear from my real family, the women at the center who call me Doña Esperanza and treat me like the wise elder I spent 71 years becoming. The women who ask for advice about business decisions, relationship choices, and life strategies because they value my experience, not my bank account. The women who understand that strength isn't inherited, it's developed through surviving things you never thought you could survive. If this story of hidden treasures and long-delayed justice touched your heart, like this video right now, tell me in the comments what gave you the strength to recognize your own value when others tried to convince you that you were worthless, and subscribe to Grandma's Legacy, because every grandmother deserves to discover that her worth was never determined by other people's opinions. The Maria Elena Vasquez Center now serves over 200 women annually and operates with an endowment that ensures we'll be helping abandoned women discover their own strength for generations to come. My grandmother's yellow box didn't just contain mineral rights worth millions of dollars. It contained a lesson I'd needed to learn. The most valuable things are often buried deepest, but they belong to the women strong enough to dig for them when storms reveal their location. Roberto, Carlos, and Marisol thought they were throwing away a used-up old woman whose best years were behind her. What they actually threw away was a woman whose greatest discoveries were still buried, waiting for the right storm to bring them to the surface. Justice doesn't always come from courtrooms and legal settlements. Sometimes it comes from discovering that your worth was never dependent on other people recognizing it, and that the best revenge is building something so meaningful that the people who abandoned you realize they gave up the chance to be part of something beautiful. And sometimes, justice comes in a yellow metal box buried in your own front yard, placed there by a grandmother wise enough to know that the women in her family would eventually need proof of their own value. The storms pass. The treasures remain. And the women strong enough to dig for them during the dark times are the ones who get to enjoy them when the sun comes out.